Hi everybody, I'm Heather Campbell, the CEO of Bush Heritage Australia. Welcome to everybody and welcome to those of you from all over the globe. I know we have people dialing into us from Italy, the Netherlands, Hungary and the UK, as well as all parts of Australia and a very large contingent from Melbourne who probably like me and others are in the joys of lockdown at the moment. So welcome to our webinar tonight on protecting habitat for species. In this, we'll be looking at the urban city population and how we can actually look at the city locations from a protection of species perspective and how we link that to the work that we do in Bush Heritage at the landscape scale. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as I sit here on the hills just to the west of the Yarra Valley near Melbourne. It'd be great to understand where all of you are sitting around the country, so please use the chat function to share with us and the broader audience where you are and who the First Nations people are of where you're sitting today. As I'm on the edge of the Yarra Valley, I'm in those hills and I can do a little 5-minute walk from our place and look down towards the city of Melbourne. And it helps me reflect on the importance of that link between what we do at Bush Heritage out in the huge landscapes and the species we look after, all the way through those corridors, through the peri-urban or the semi-rural environment that I live in, and those little orchids that I'm now seeing in spring, or the brush-tailed phascogales, which I know are on the property, all the way through to Melbourne and the fantastic gardens that people have, their backyards, the link with the pollinators, within that not just be, the European honeybee, but very much the native bees. Also how we link into looking at all species within an urban environment, whether that may be falcons who are nesting in our major city buildings, or the pollinators, as I said, or those birds in our backyards. And certainly I know myself, I have seen far more birds this year, or maybe I've just been more aware as I've taken those times during lockdown to go out for that 1 hour of outside exercise off the property. So tonight's going to be pretty special. We're going to share some stories. We're going to hear from Professor Sarah Bekessy. So I just want to share a little bit of information about Sarah. So Professor Sarah Bekessy leads the ICON Science Research Group at RMIT, which is an interdisciplinary approach to solving complex biodiversity conservation programs. Her areas of focus include understanding human behaviour and conservation and designing cities for everyday nature experience. Tonight, Sarah will be taking you on a journey looking at protecting life on land, which, as many of you will know, is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 15. And she'll be looking at that life at land through the lens of everyday nature for the future of our cities. Re-enchanting urban residents with nature can deliver a remarkable range of health benefits while creating cities that are more resilient to climate change. We at Bush Heritage, our purpose is to bring the bush back to good health. We do this through the work on our reserves and working in partnership. And one of the ways we measure our impact is through indicator ecosystems and indicator species. And this approach that we use out in the large landscapes is also very much one that can be used more in our cities and our more urban areas as we look at things like pollinators, birds, or microbats and their critical role that they play in those livable communities that we all love. So creating everyday nature in cities is a way of connecting people back to the nature and everything that we do at a lot larger scale, and the importance of biodiversity on a daily basis and making sure we get those daily doses, not just of vitamin D from the sunshine, but also our daily dose of biodiversity. So Sarah, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to be able to share my research with you. I'm actually in a very small town called Mitamita, all of 19 permanent residents, which is gloriously isolated in the far northeast of Victoria. It's so isolated indeed that the recent sort of easing of restrictions for rural residents doesn't really probably have much of an impact on our lives. If there are no restaurants and cafes to visit, then it doesn't really matter if they're open or not. But yes, I want to talk today about cities and nature, which possibly seems like a topic that's quite far removed, I suppose, from the activities of bush heritage on face value. But I'd actually argue that they've got, those ideas have actually got quite a lot in common. I think first and foremost, the idea of bringing nature back into cities and allowing nature to thrive in the places where we live and we play and we work has got a lot of parallels to the idea that it's at the heart of what bush heritage does, which is bringing the bush back to good health. I think secondly, bush heritage is about caring for and protecting species and ecosystems that no one else, nowhere else is caring for and protecting. And unfortunately, cities are full of species and ecosystems that definitely fit into that category. Many species and ecosystems will absolutely depend on the activities the actions that we undertake to protect them within the bounds of our cities. And I think finally, bush heritage has at its heart genuine collaboration with traditional owners of this country. And that's actually one of the things that make me the absolute proudest about being a board member of bush heritage. And likewise, in our work, we see bringing nature back into cities as a key opportunity to both connect urban residents with traditional knowledge and inspire respect, but also to generate opportunities for Indigenous people to plan, to implement and to govern everyday nature and urban greening experiences. Interestingly, it was not that long ago that the idea of nature in the city was a highly niche concept. And actually, I just want to start my talk with a little anecdote that highlights how much things have changed, I think, just in the last even decade. And that is that a few weeks ago now, I was asked to be part of about 30 experts who met on Zoom to advise the ABC about an augmented reality project that's going to be run in parallel with a new documentary series that we'll probably be seeing soon on our televisions called Big Weather and How to Survive It. And the experts were asked to dream up what a truly resilient city would look like. All the things that are either here or we know are coming our way, the bushfires, the heat waves, the floods, the droughts, the cyclones, and also the lived experience of being in a city. While this actually might look like a dream to some of us at the moment, interacting this closely with anyone, it's a lived reality of being in exponentially growing population zones where we are interacting very closely with people on an everyday basis, and that can be very stressful. Likewise, being in isolation in a time like COVID is creating a lot, we know, of mental anxiety. How do we maintain resilience of communities with confronting those kinds of challenges as well? And that invited fire chiefs and engineers and planners to come together to really dream up this vision of resilience in cities. And I think they were anticipating quite technological smart city solutions to this problem. But a very surprising outcome for me, and perhaps for everyone, was that this was actually the focus of most of our discussion. The idea of nature-based solutions in cities, using rooftop gardens and urban forests to lower the temperature and reduce heat waves in cities, and lower the kind of impact of stormwater runoff, for example. Using mangroves and wetlands to buffer storm surges in city zones. Planting fire-resistant vegetation or strategically planted vegetation to reduce the risk of fire to fire damage to infrastructure, for example. And the idea that generating everyday doses of nature, as Heather referred to, is an experience that we really need to enhance community resilience in cities. We know it's critical for our health and our well-being, and that's been highlighted so tangibly in the time of COVID, when there have been people with nature and people without nature near where they're living and working and playing. And that's become quite a big social justice issue that I think people are very much aware of now. So relatively quickly, the world has shifted to thinking of this idea that, you know, embracing nature is a critical part of our thinking about resilience in cities in the face of future challenges. You'll see that there's massive global interest and investment in this space. There's great recognition now that the benefits that I've listed there on the right of your screen are remarkable and worth investing in. The well-being benefits, knowing that if you live in a street with more biodiversity, your children will have lower risk of asthma and allergies. If they play in a schoolyard with more biodiversity, they'll have improved cognitive development. You'll sleep better. You'll have lower risk of mental health and well-being issues. Lower risk of intriguing things like heart disease and diabetes, not necessarily linked to exercise, but, you know, I find the mechanisms that drive these health benefits, you know, fascinating. I don't have time in my 20 minutes to go into it, but it's a really fruitful and fascinating field of research. The European Union is very much aware of this opportunity, if you like. This is a project that I'm actually lucky enough to be involved in as a researcher. It's called Urban Green Up. It's a 36 million euro project run by the European Commission. And we are implementing and studying the outcomes of nature-based solutions in cities around the world. And they are keen to know how best to use nature-based solutions to maximise some of those benefits I was describing, to reduce noise in streets, for example, to lower air pollution and reduce temperature in heat waves, how best to plant vegetation so that we increase retail street productivity, for example. Really fascinating co-benefits. What I'm personally very interested in is how all of this activity intersects with biodiversity conservation, because of course it's possible to fill a city with trees that have very little benefit for biodiversity. Anyone who's lived in a street full of plane trees will know exactly what I'm talking about, I think. And that's a shame, because on the one hand, we stand to lose a lot in terms of species and ecosystems, and many of them threatened with extinction. These are just a handful of the species that are threatened with extinction around Melbourne. Species like in the bottom there, the Frankston spider orchid, that completely depends on what we do in Frankston for its future to survive. The growling grass frog, the matted flax lily. These are all species that exist in cities and depend on our actions to protect them in cities. And in fact, this study that I've cited there in the corner found that cities are disproportionately important places to conserve biodiversity. We found that there were 3 times the number of threatened species per unit area in and around cities as there are in their rural counterparts, which again is a totally fascinating correlation that I'd love to be able to go into more, but don't have time to at the moment. But it's also an important lost opportunity, because if you focus on species diversity in cities, there are also massive co-benefits to people. Oh, here I've just got a few extra images of just species and ecosystems that you may not have thought of as being critically dependent on our actions within cities to protect them. This is the Basalt Plains grassland. Once, you know, supported enormous biodiversity and benefited people, you know, incredibly, a bit like the prairies of America, but unfortunately a much maligned and neglected ecosystem, and there's less than 1% of it left, and most of that 1% is still in the path of housing development on the edges of Melbourne. This is the Cumberland Plains around Sydney. Again, very little of this ecosystem left. It's a critically endangered, one of our most endangered ecosystems. We've lost 10 mammal species from this ecosystem just in the last, I think, 12 years, I read. Well, this is the Swan Coastal Plain around Perth, where, you know, we have cleared massive swathes of this ecosystem for housing development just in very recent times. I read a statistic between 1993 and 2004, 120,000 hectares of this ecosystem were lost mostly to housing development, and much more planned to be cleared going into the future. This is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, one of 15 identified world biodiversity hotspots. But as I said, it's not just for the sake, it's actually, it's actually enlightened self-interest to be thinking about how we maintain diversity and biodiversity in our cities as well. Because all of those benefits I mentioned previously are maximised when we think about biodiversity and not just green. This is a really interesting study that just came out of the University of Adelaide that linked native biodiverse vegetation in parks to an increase in the beneficial microbia in the soils, and then linking that directly to human immunity. So having diverse native vegetation in parks is good for our immune systems. We also know that there are many ways in which health is benefited by biodiverse urban greening, and not just the green. We know that biodiverse urban greening will be more resilient to drought and insect attack, for example, as well. It's a very important opportunity, unfortunately, because people, even when we don't have lockdown, people tend not to be leaving cities and exploring nature in the same numbers as we used to see. And so cities are a really critical opportunity to re-enchant people with nature. This is something that I'm really proud of, a little book that we wrote a few years ago. One of the co-authors, Kate Cranny, who actually used to work for Bush Heritage, I believe, illustrated it beautifully. Some amazing pictures of insects around Melbourne that children, preschool and primary school children, use in many different schools and preschools around Victoria now to discover the insects in their backyards and in their schools. But it's also, I think there's something that we often miss, and that urban planners and designers miss, and that is that biodiversity is a really critical way to generate that sense of place in cities that we are kind of losing, I suppose, with the expansion of ideas like globalization. Cities can feel the same. You know that you've come out of a plane and you're in Melbourne because of the smells and the sounds, and a lot of that is to do with the biodiversity. City of Melbourne recognise this. They're really keen to bring some native vegetation and species back to the city, and we've been helping them try and select appropriate species for that kind of rewilding process. And they're really keen to use species that can tell significant stories. And particularly, they're really interested in telling significant Indigenous stories. So using this yam daisy, once a really important food source for people of Melbourne, or this common brown butterfly, which once used to emerge in massive numbers in Melbourne at the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons. Wouldn't that be an enchanting thing to have back in Melbourne? The emergence of a moth, and everyone knowing that that's the start of one of the key Wurundjeri 7 seasons. Let me just digress for two seconds just to tell you about a really fantastic, I think, piece of research that we've been involved with over the last couple of years that kind of pulls a lot of these threads together. And that is linking, working with traditional owners to bestow totem species for schools. And the schools can create habitat for those species, learn about the ecology of habitat creation, learn about the significance of those species to the traditional owners of their local area, learn and build respect for those traditional owners through the knowledge that they impart about protecting and caring for those species. And then I think critically, creating a kind of sense of spiritual connection that I think we often lose in some respects in terms of the modern way of talking about conservation as being a ecosystem service or what have you. The fact that if you look after a certain species, it's going to look after you through your life, and creating that kind of connection with children at a really, really young age. And at the same time, creating biodiversity in schools and increasing, cognitive development. There are so many tick boxes, I feel like, with this project. It's extraordinary. It's been a really great success, and I would love to see it rolled out in schools, across the country. Bringing us back to reality here. This image that I've painted of cities where nature is thriving, where we're kind of respecting Indigenous culture, and we're rewilding our streets with significant species, and we're all benefiting from it immensely. That is not going to happen by accident, And unfortunately, it's not the way that we currently think about doing standard urban development in this country. This slide probably represents how we still kind of think about nature in terms of urban development. So this is actually a real billboard on the outskirts of Melbourne. Big house, big car, big success. That's me, baby. And it's over the top of an endangered grassland here. Sadly, we still see biodiversity as being a problem in urban development. There's actually a name for it. It's called the constraint layer. We think of biodiversity as being a problem and a constraint. And the way that we often work towards dealing with biodiversity is to remove it in cities and offset it, usually outside of cities where it's cheaper and easier to do that. And the way that we do urban development, the classic sort of forms, the urban forms that we kind of are reproducing across the country, are not amenable to the idea of everyday nature on the whole. This is an urban fringe development, actually directly opposite a critically endangered grassland here in, I think this is in Reservoir on the outskirts of Melbourne. But can you look at this front garden? I mean, what sort of everyday nature experiences are people going to be having? And, you know, people in, there's a really, often because it's such a car-based culture, not culture, but by necessity, in the way that a lot of these developments are formed, people don't necessarily have time in their days to even experience nature, even when it's across the road here. Unfortunately, this is a barbed wire fence around the critically endangered grassland. So people are not going to be, there's not cues to care here. People aren't going to be engaged with nature in a positive way. This suburb has been designed as sort of antithesis of kind of the concept of everyday nature. But that's a really predominant way of urban development happening in this country. This is the other predominant way, and that's the high rises in the middle of our cities. And again, really hard, not impossible, but very hard to generate, you know, great everyday nature experiences when you're on the top of one of these buildings. There's actually a really interesting planning theory that you need to be able to yell out of your window and your kids need to be able to hear you. and that is the height of a building that is going to allow connection with streetscape and allow you to sort of, I suppose, have those everyday nature experiences. And this is the third type of urban development that we often have in Australia, and that's the knockdown rebuild in the middle ring, which I'm sure all of you probably know what I'm talking about here, where you might have an existing house, maybe on a quarter-acre block if it's lucky, I suppose, but knocked down. You might have one large house that occupies the entire site now, or perhaps 2 or 3 townhouses. Not really great in terms of yield, number of people that you're actually fitting into the city, but catastrophic in terms of backyards and access to nature. And you often see, all of the street trees and much of the backyard actually disappearing. And it's having a really significant impact on the amount of biodiversity that we see in our suburbs. So instead of that, we need to have really intentional strategies for looking at the needs of species in our cities and actually building those needs and building that ecological understanding into the design approaches that we use. We need really intentional strategies for doing that. As I said before, the way that we currently deal with biodiversity, the biodiversity problem in cities, is mostly through offsetting. And let me just spend 2 minutes kind of debunking this idea. The idea is that you can clear vegetation in a city and it's okay because we're going to find somewhere else outside of the city and plant a few trees and the net kind of biodiversity of the world will be kind of somehow sort of even. This is a kind of the ecological reality of this is that that's a sort of, it's based on a lot of I think it's based on some fallacies that you can actually create. Generally, you can actually create habitat from scratch, which you can create habitat, but can you create a whole ecosystem? I don't think anyone's actually achieved that yet. We don't even know most of the species in our ecosystems, let alone have the capacity to recreate it. But it also is based on the fallacy that, biodiversity in one place equates to biodiversity in another place. And that's, obviously not the case for most species that use, that really sort of have quite place-based needs, for example. It's also really critical when it comes to people. I think this terrible story that I'm quickly going to tell you really highlights the farcical notion that you can offset vegetation in one place, put in another, and it will be a net sort of no net loss. There's a current offset that's been designed for the loss of trees on the side of the Western Highway expansion, and some of these trees have been used by the traditional owners of this area for upward of 800 years as birthing trees, places where Aboriginal women have given birth for so many generations, and we can offset these trees. I mean, I think that it's entirely farcical. I think I just want to quickly finish on my offsetting rant with this kind of satirical website that I think really captures the essence of why offsetting gives me headaches. And this is a satirical website based in the UK called Cheat Neutral, whereby you can actually cheat on your partner, but you can pay someone to abstain from cheating. And so therefore the net happiness of the world will be around equal. It might even be a net gain, you never know. And so therefore, no problem. Wouldn't actually advise you kind of visiting that website, because I don't think it is a genuine offer there. But it just highlights, I think, the ethical and deep kind of problems, the idea of offsetting. So instead, we think we need to reframe nature in the urban setting. Rather than a problem to be offset, we see it as being a massive asset and opportunity to be maximised at every step of the planning and design process. And so we designed this protocol called biodiversity sensitive urban design that seeks to enhance the on-site biodiversity, not to offset, but we call it onsetting, improving the likelihood that native species and ecosystems will persist in urban landscapes at the same time as doing development, truly sustainable development. And we've been working with a few developers to try and sort of implement this approach. And it's a series of steps that I'm just going to briefly take you through. We start by investigating the site. That's probably pretty obvious, but rather than just thinking about what do we currently have, because in cities we've already lost so much, we ask people to expand their horizons and think about what we could bring back. What are the charismatic or exciting or species that might have key ecosystem services that we could bring back to a site. Then you have to identify your objectives. This might include thinking about what's ecologically feasible, what's socially acceptable, what species might have conservation value, for example, but also critically, which species have got cultural significance. And again, as I mentioned, we've been working with the City of Melbourne to try and go through this process to understand which species might be targets for them to rewild Melbourne with. After setting objectives, you've really got to think carefully about how you're going to actually design for those chosen species or ecosystems. And we say that there are three things you have to keep in mind. The first is thinking about resources. Second is thinking about threats. And third is thinking about connectivity. So in terms of resources, obviously thinking about habitat and vegetation is going to be key. And so having diversity of both structure and species in our city streetscapes is a really key step here. And sadly, we do this quite badly in cities. We rarely see anything other than a kind of canopy tree in our city streets. But why not have an understory or a mid-story? And so many species would benefit with that kind of simple change in the way that we see streetscapes. Or it might actually be thinking about providing what we call habitat analogues. So thinking about a building as being a place to intentionally design for animals to use or plants. This is a building in Jerusalem that has intentionally designed roof cavity spaces for birds to nest. Or this brick from, I think, a high-rise building in New York, where birds can nest in one side and people can observe them nesting through a perspex screen that's on the inside of the building. That's real re-enchantment with nature. Thinking about threats is the next key step. And, you know, urban environments can be extremely hostile places for most flora and fauna. And so systematically thinking about what the key threats to each of your objective species or ecosystems are. And it might be that it's as simple as kind of changing your glass to be bird-friendly glass. I don't know why all glass in this country isn't bird-friendly glass, but just by slanting glass downwards by a slight angle, birds see the ground rather than the sky and don't fly into it. Creative solutions like underpasses for roads, for frogs, for example, you know, a kind of becoming more, not, I wouldn't say commonplace, but people are actually considering them in new suburb designs now. But yeah, lighting, roading, thinking about your windows and your building products are all really kind of key ways to actually mitigate for threats. Or things like cats outside and dogs outside that are off leash, for example, that can be really key threats to a lot of native fauna. And the other key aspect is connectivity. So of course we have to think about the core habitat in our cities as being, you know, big parks, riverside vegetation, for example. But we have been working with the Fisherman's Bend Authority to try and design a biodiversity plan for that site and use biodiversity sensitive urban design for that site. And we're arguing that every single street in Fisherman's Bend can be a way of actually connecting up that environment for biodiversity. Planting, if we get every person to have a citrus plant, for example, on their balcony, then we might have some hope of actually bringing back, you know, certain butterfly species. Simple things that we think are entirely possible even in the most dense, you know, densely urbanized and, you know, post-industrial kind of environments. The next step, of course, is that we need to be really quite rigorous. You know, again, another parallel, I think, with bush heritage in the way that they operate, an extremely rigorous approach to evaluating actions and thinking about how your designs are going to play out. And so this is where biodiversity sensitive urban design becomes a bit more technical. And we have some key approaches either through modelling or expert elicitation or the like to really evaluate what your different designs are going to contribute quantitatively in terms of the likelihood that species or ecosystems are going to persist on your site. And you can think through the design phase, the construction phase, or even the inhabitation phase. So providing cues to care or community education, stewardship programs, or activities like, or regulations like cat containment, for example. I think a key difference is seeing people as part of the solution rather than part of the problem to conservation. And, you know, don't we all need that? I think it's a really positive aspect about all of this. Designing opportunities for people to really contribute and to knowingly contribute to the return of species is, you know, surely one of the most positive experiences that you can design. So yeah, it's thinking about creative ways of engaging people. And it might be through, you know, citizen science programs or creating urban forms that actually, you know, engage you with stewardship. And that's actually an explicit design intention. Something that I've been involved with a lot has been this idea of wildlife gardening. When I had a student, Laura Moomore, who has spearheaded this approach in Melbourne really effectively. And she surveyed people who are engaged in the whole practice of wildlife gardening and found that not just were they able to bring back some really key biodiversity to their gardens and their environments, but it was a really important way to build kind of, you know, personal resilience and sometimes community resilience. This person says it's a wonderful thing. It's better than going to a psychiatrist. So the key to everyday nature is, yes, thinking about big parks, riverside vegetation, you know, corridors, for example, but also thinking about the little things, streetscapes, roundabouts, roofs and walls. We can have everyday nature experiences in so many different locations when you start to think creatively like this. We need it to be where people are working, where they are playing, where they are living. So I think in summary, I've tried to outline some of the really exciting opportunities here for unleashing the potential of nature in our cities, highlighting on the one hand the myriad of benefits to people that designing for everyday nature can deliver. On the other hand, the critical role of cities in conserving many of our threatened species. And I think the future of our cities may well depend on this new conceptualization of the urban fabric, an urban fabric where nature can thrive and people can enjoy every day the truly remarkable range of benefits that we know nature can deliver. Thank you very much.
So our first question is from Brandon, and it really is, should we encourage architectural designers and developers to re-veg according to the EVC of their area instead of planting for aesthetics and planting for boosting biodiversity, or encourage landowners to favour a larger percentage of landscape planted to natives in their areas? So a bit of a technical question. Sarah?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really good question. And, it actually, one of the things that's kind of horrified me a bit stepping into this space has been the lack of ecological education that's provided to landscape architects and architects and the like. And actually, if you think about it, we're asking them to flip on this topic of nature quite dramatically. I feel like the history of designing cities has been to design places to keep people safe from nature, to keep nature, away from us. And so it's a big flip to actually ask designers to now design a place that actually can invite nature back in. And so it does actually really challenge some of the fundamentals of design in some respects, to give them credit for why it's, not happening overnight, I suppose. But I think on the other side, it's challenging for ecologists and probably many of us are kind of like-minded in that respect, to think about the kind of nature that's going to be important for people in cities, because it's not just, sure, the conservation of nature in cities is an absolutely critical pursuit, but we are not going to win on that front without actually considering that primarily we're going to be designing for people. And so, and people can be enchanted by nature that can be a scrappy bit of nature in a park that is, barely native would certainly not be something that would be composed of an EVC, for example. So yeah, I think we've got a lot of remaining challenges to work out how we sort of, what that balancing act looks like. But certainly we know scientifically that planting more native and more locally native species leads to a greater richness of native fauna. And, and native plants are actually biodiversity in their own right, of course. So personally, I definitely recommend, planting kind of in a way that can and sort of emulate historical vegetation, but not being too kind of head up about it, and relaxing to the degree that is necessary. And a really interesting example is we're working with Brimbank City Council, who have a big aim to increase canopy cover in that council, because it's been identified as a really important, vulnerable community when it comes to heat waves in Melbourne. And they're really keen to enhance the canopy cover to reduce the temperatures in Brimbank and reduce the kind of, mortality and morbidity that comes from heat waves in that part of the world. But of course, Brimbank, for anyone who knows, is a grassland ecosystem, and so there wouldn't normally be a canopy cover in Brimbank. So how do we're trying to argue that yes, we can have canopy, but we can have an understory of grassland species that also celebrates the local vegetation and contributes to the conservation of that local vegetation. But you can see that there are going to be at times tensions between the EVC in a pure sense and some sort of way of creating vegetation that's going to balance human needs as well as kind of the needs for conservation. But I think we can do it. All it requires is really careful design.
This next one is a really interesting quandary that I think we're going through at the moment, or there is potential to almost be backlash towards nature in our cities. So this has come through from Ken, who's actually listening to us in Kobe in Japan. So welcome, Ken, from the other part of the world at the moment. And that question around the concern that, SARS, COVID-2, the COVID viruses have maybe come from bats or jumped from animals into humans. And as our urban areas encroach upon natural environments and that interaction, that there's that potential that there might be that increase of viruses or things that evolve out of wild animals into humans. So there's that question around how can we balance the need for that, biological diversity of our natural world and our urban living styles and encroachment. So this is probably a question that we could probably talk for about a good hour or two on. But have you got any initial, thoughts, Sarah? Because it is a big one, and I think it's been discussed a lot.
I'll try and keep it short, even though I could probably give an hour-long lecture on it. It's a really good question, and I think it's one that the conservation community are really struggling with at the moment to kind of respond to. But I think let me just broaden up to start with, and that is that, problems with urban nature are some of the first things that they often come my way when we try to kind of implement biodiversity sensitive urban design in places. People talk about not just, I think diseases are kind of, the hottest and most sort of, at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, but, possums are stinky and noisy and they eat my roses, or, what about leaves in my gutter? What about the roots actually, damaging infrastructure? What about, safety risk if a branch is going to fall on my child? What about fire risk? And I could really go on and on and on and on and on. And actually, my answer to that is that every single one of those problems has a design solution. And I know that because we've worked through them all. And we just have to anticipate them and actually design with those things in mind. When it comes to diseases, it's a tricky thing. We know that it wasn't actually bats or pangolins that actually gave us COVID, but we do know that these diseases sometimes evolve where in places where we've got lots of damage to ecosystems. I think that's kind of been something that's come out from the United Nations, IUCN. There's a really interesting report on the emergence of kind of new diseases in places where we're actually damaging nature. So, I think the solution to that is let's not damage nature. But yes, I think that human-wildlife conflict is something that we have to manage really carefully in this space that I'm talking about. But I just don't think it should be a reason for not doing it. The health benefits of engaging with nature and having it near where we live and play and work are so massive. They're so compelling. Our Department of Environment in Victoria has an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with the Health Department. That's how highly it's kind of recognised that this link is real, and it's actually, a compelling public health investment. That's relatively cheap, and it delivers a heck of a lot in terms of public health benefit and preventative medicine. So yeah, I think it's all. I think there are two things here. It's a balancing act. The benefits and have to be weighed up against any potential costs, if there are any. I think a lot of it's been myths and kind of blow-ups, actually. But then the second thing is that there's careful design can actually be used to mitigate any of the threats that we perceive or that that are real or mythical.
Great, thanks, Sarah. There's a great comment here from Cassie, which is sort of a question and a comment, but also around, doesn't biodiversity actually help reduce the risks through that breadth of biodiversity and the sort of the dilution that you get by not having really concentrated intrusions into very specific ecosystems, for example. So I don't know if you want to make a comment or anything from that sort of regard at all.
Well, I think certainly there's been some really compelling reports. I can direct people to the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. I think they've put out two really relevant reports on that particular topic, which are really about, you know, how do these diseases emerge? And fundamentally, it's about, you know, sort of interfering with and reducing biodiversity, and actually, a key solution is actually maintaining biodiversity. And, you know, I think to the credit of bush heritage, having places where biodiversity can thrive, probably, you know, in places where we don't have so much conflict with people is a critical aspect to all of this. But yeah, I'd really direct you to those reports, because I think they answer a lot of the kind of concerns that people have about wildlife in cities.
In one of your slides, you mentioned a BSUD document, and they're asking, is that available for public access for, you know, because they were looking to evaluate a bush block?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So if they just Google away, they'll find it?
You search for biodiversity sensitive urban design, you'll find our website and our documents. And if you can't find them, then that's terrible, but please maybe email me. I'm pretty easy to find on the email too, so just email me and I can send you the documents.
Look, and certainly if there are any questions we don't manage to answer tonight, we'll respond to people. And if you've got any questions you think about once you leave, or information that you want followed up on, if you email us at Bush Heritage, and we'll be able to do that for you. One question here: what would you suggest is the most important thing when implementing planning for a new subdivision to ensure biodiversity values? And there may not be one most important thing, so you may just want to refer to the breadth.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think just there are many things to consider. But, you know, fundamentally, it's about really injecting ecological understanding in the whole process. You know, understanding your site as an ecological site and having ecological foundations, understanding the ecological history of your site, and thinking really carefully about the impacts that you're going to have, how to avoid them, and how to create a place through design that genuinely benefits biodiversity. I mean, we think that there's really no excuse for creating new urban environments in places with very high biodiversity values now. There is enough of Australia and the world that is seriously degraded in our cities, on the edges of our cities, basically everywhere, to allow us to generate housing for people without having to cut down vegetation. So, you know, step one, I suppose, is seek out places where you can do something that's going to be regenerative, where you're actually going to be giving back. And that's why it's been so fun to work on the Fisherman's Bend site, and that's a kind of ex-industrial site in the centre of Melbourne, where they're dreaming about bringing back a whole bunch of species to engage people with nature. That's a really great experience working on that site. But yeah, I think step one is probably let's try and choose sites to develop that don't have much in the way of biodiversity value, and use urban development as a kind of regenerative process to bring back rather than destroy.
Thanks. Look, we have run out of time, and there's a whole suite more of questions. We will get back to all of you that have put questions in. I know Sarah's going to love spending the next day or so answering all of the questions, etc. But lots of questions around design, you know, good examples of where design has worked really well, and people wanting to share those examples of whether it be house design, suburb design, etc. I would just like to, I suppose, close by sharing a little anecdote myself. And I didn't realise when we built our house that a colour-bond bullnose veranda would be a perfect home for microbats. The little corrugations are the brilliant spots for them to come in and nest. They sort of line themselves up, get the sonar working, and sort of dive in there. So it's amazing what you can find if you sort of look around, think of different examples and different ways that you can actually build native environments or habitats into your buildings, into your areas. And even though sometimes it can be a bit challenging, we know that foxes come into urban environments and all of those sorts of things, or sulphur-crested cockatoos steal your broad beans, as they did for me yesterday. But there's also that wonder and joy that comes from having that connection with nature, that joy of seeing your kids or grandkids actually see that connection with a bug and understand that a cockroach is not something to be feared, but actually something that has a really important role. So thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to everybody that is dialed in from all over the globe for us this evening. Really enjoyed sharing and talking with you, and look forward to having a conversation with all of you in the future. As I said, we will get back to all of you with the questions that we weren't able to respond to this evening. But thank you so much. Please, any further comments, send them through on the chat or email us and we'll get back to you.